Hello, MUS 1002 students. This is a video to accompany the chapter in the text on a brief history of synthesizers. Just a couple things for you to be aware. Because of YouTube Content ID and my desire not to have videos taken down or be sued, I am not going to be playing any audio examples in this video. Instead, please refer to the textbook, which has hyperlinks in the PDF form, to Spotify, where you can listen to all of these great sounding synths for free and without fear of copyright infringement. Also, be aware that this is a very brief history of synthesizers. I will probably not cover everything. I'll probably not include your favorite synth, and I apologize for that. I just want to give you a general overview of the synth and its history. So it's going to be a very quick look at some of the classics. Let's start out. Before the synth, we have some really interesting precursors dating back to the 18th century when people started to experiment with electricity and things like the Helmholtz resonator. But aside from the Helmholtz resonator, nothing really survives. Jumping ahead to the end of the 19th century, in 1876, we have the musical telegraph created by Elisha Gray as a byproduct of telephone technology experimentation. It was essentially creating the first electromagnetic circuit that would create regular vibrations. This is the oscillator, the core of any synthesizer. Pretty cool. That was adapted in 1897 by Thaddeus Cahill in the telharmonium. At first, he experimented with using oscillators, but then switched to tone wheels, which were later used by Lawrence Hammond for his Hammond organ, which is still a staple of jazz performance. And it used dynamos to produce sound and then transmitted the sound over telephone lines. This was actually kind of cool because it also was the very first subscription music service. In fact, in the New York City area, several restaurants subscribed to Cahill's service, and he would perform on the telharmonium, and the sound would travel through telephone lines to the different restaurants and be played in the background for their patrons. Unfortunately, it was a huge flop because it required tons of power, to the point that you could watch all of the lights in the surrounding neighborhood dim when he turned it on. And also because it transmitted over the phone lines, it could be interrupted by phone calls. And here is a picture of the console of the telharmonium. I have not been able to find pictures of the rest of the instrument. Following into the 20th century, we have one of the big ones, the theremin, by Leon, also known as Lev Theremin, a Russian inventor who really led probably the most interesting life in the history of 20th century musicians. The theremin is the only instrument that you play without actually touching. You have two antennas, one vertical and one horizontal. And they are both connected to heterodyning oscillators. One controls the pitch, that would be the vertical, and the other regulates volume. So you never actually touch the instrument. It's really difficult to play, although there is a fingering system that exists for it. It is notable as the first electronic instrument to use Lee DeForest's vacuum tubes that were created in 1907. Originally, the sound was just a sine wave, but this was expanded by Bob Moog, whose name is going to pop up quite a bit, to include other waveforms. Theremin's goal was to have a theremin in every home, but his timing was not great. While it was originally created in 1920s and he was going around touring in the US and presenting demonstrations and concerts, it was commercially released right before the Great Depression in 1929. Bad timing. But it caught on with composers, especially in film composing. Miklos Roza's scores for Spellbound and The Last Weekend feature it notably, as does Bernard Herrmann's score for the sci-fi classic The Day the Earth Stood Still. On top of that, there was Clara Rockmore, a student of theremins who was originally a violinist but then learned to play the theremin and became its first major virtuoso and developed the fingering technique for it that is still used today. And here is a picture. You can see the vertical antenna, which the arm is used to control pitch by proximity, and then the horizontal loop antenna uses the left hand to increase or decrease volume. Beyond the theremin, there were some other very interesting electronic instruments, chiefly the Ons Martineau, which was created in 1928 by Maurice Martineau over in France. It uses a keyboard and ring controller attached to a ribbon. You would stick your finger in the ring and then move it horizontally, and that would allow you to produce either discrete pitches like a keyboard or a pure glissandi, gliding from note to note like a theremin when someone held down the intensity key. It had a variety of different wave shapes that it outputted, and you could actually use a mixer built onto the Ons Martineau to mix between them and create different timbres. It also used different speakers that Martineau called diffusers to sculpt the output sound by having resonators or having strings attached to them that would subtly change the sound. It is extremely expressive. Unlike any other keyboard instrument, full vibrato is possible. You can use the ring controller to get vibrato similar to wiggling your finger on a violin or on a cello. Because of this, it was very popular in both classical and pop music. Olivier Messiaen used it in his Turangallia Symphony, and Radiohead are noted fans, using it extensively on Kid A and in Rainbows, specifically the tracks The National Anthem, How to Disappear Completely, and Weird Fish's Arpeggi, which uses multiple Ons Martineau. Daft Punk also used it extensively on Random Access Memories. And while it is extremely expensive and kind of finicky to get your hands on an original, you can get a modern recreation in the form of the Theravox, which is just over the bridge from us in Windsor, Ontario. And here is a picture of the Ons Martineau. You can see on the left side, they have the intensity key, which is the clear white acrylic. And then next to that are the dials for the waveform mixers. Below the keyboard, you can sort of see the ring controller, and then you have the keyboard as well. Another interesting development was the Trautonium, which was created in 1929 by Frederick Trautwein, and later joined by Oscar Sala, who continued to develop the instrument until his death in 2002. This uses the subharmonic scale to create bell-like sounds, and later used sawtooth oscillators to create even more expressive timbres. It uses a resistor wire, which is effectively a ribbon controller, similar to the ring controller on the Ons Martineau, instead of a keyboard. Now, this is very interesting because it allows the performer to dip into microtonal scales and play between the notes that you would hear on a standard keyboard instrument or on a fretted instrument like a guitar. It also allowed the performer to use vibrato and to glide between the notes. In classical music, it was used extensively by composers Paul Hindemith, who wrote a concerto for it, and Richard Strauss, whose Japanese festival music uses it extensively. Sala also later expanded it to add a noise generator, an envelope, and a bandpass filter influenced by synths from Bob Moog and Don Buchla. He called this the Mixter Trautonium and used it extensively for sound designs for major festivals, including the Bayreuth Opera Festival, and it was used in film scores, including Alfred Hitchcock's classic The Birds. Now, the ribbon controller idea was extremely popular. In fact, both Bob Moog and Dieter Doepfer use it on their synths. It is a very popular method for synth control and very, very expressive. And here is a picture of the Trautonium. You can see that you have the ribbon, but then you have little keys, as this is the Mixter Trautonium, that are roughly arranged in pitches, but they can all be readjusted to give you microtonal scales. You just simply press the key down to the ribbon, or you press the ribbon directly. And then all of the knobs allow you to mix in different waveforms, add or change different filters, or get really, really fine grain control with the envelope. But this leads to early analog synths, which really only became possible in the post-World War II era, with the development of analog oscillators, filters, envelope generators, and refinements to vacuum tubes, all of which were primarily developed in World War II, or in the case of vacuum tubes, refined. This led to two major synthesizers that had a huge local influence, the RCA Mark I and Mark II, which were both put into the Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio. So, used in New York City, nowhere else. These were gigantic machines that used 12 oscillator circuits, filters, frequency dividers, resonators to generate harmonics, and all sorts of modulators to shape the sound. Very cool, but all of these had to be manually entered on punch cards for every parameter, which made it really hard to use and very expensive. That said, it was used in some very, very important pieces. Philomel by Milton Babbitt, Metamorphosis by Vladimir Ussachevsky, Synchronisms, including Number 6 by Mario Davidovsky, which won him the Pulitzer Prize, and Times Encomium by Charles Wuorinen, which also won the Pulitzer Prize for music. And here is a picture of Milton Babbitt with the RCA Mark II. It literally takes up an entire room all by itself. But leading into the 60s, we get the big ones, the big three, the trinity of synths, starting with Bob Moog, who created his first major synthesizer at the request of composer Herb Deutsch. It was much smaller than the Mark II. Still huge, still expensive, but much more affordable and easier to put into a smaller room. It was made famous by synthesist and composer and also keyboard virtuoso performer Wendy Carlos on her album Switched on Bach, and paved the way for Moog's smaller revision, the Mini Moog D, which is the most successful synthesizer of all time, used by Herbie Hancock, Sun Ra, Trent Reznor, Radiohead, Dr. Dre, the list goes on. Moog is very important because he codified the use of both the keyboard with the piano-style layout as the main controller of a synthesizer, and the ADSR envelope. On top of this, he also created what's known as the ladder filter, a staple of the Moog sound, and the concept of the modular synthesizer, that you can have a synthesizer built of separate units, and each of those module units controls a specific function that you can then patch together with patch cables. That was on the East Coast. Over in California, on the West Coast, you had Don Buchla, who created the Buchla 100 synthesizer for Morton Subotnick at the San Francisco Tape Music Center. It is a groundbreaking instrument because it is the first to include a sequencer, and somewhat infamously LSD, on the red panel. It was used on Subotnick's groundbreaking album Silver Apples of the Moon, which was commissioned by None Such Records and is the first major piece of electronic music commissioned by a major record label. Following these developments, we also had Alan Perlman, who created the ARP company using his initials, and released the celebrated ARP 2500, which is used extensively by Eliane Radig in her pieces Adnos 1, 2, and 3, and the much smaller and much more popular 2600, which was used by people like Edgar Winter, Stevie Wonder, and is the voice of everyone's favorite droid, R2-D2. All of these, again, are voltage-controlled modular synthesizers. Here is a picture of an early Moog. a Buchla 100, the ARP 2500. With voltage control, everything is controlled by electricity, regulated by a human interface controller. Traditionally, this is a piano-style keyboard, but it could also be a ribbon. It could be a joystick, or in the case of Don Buchla, you could get some crazier things like the Thunder controller. Electricity is analog and is in a constant state of flow or change. This results in continuous control, which means that playing it is super responsive due to lightning-fast response via changes in voltage. So this means that you can use oscillators and they can play literally any note and vibrato. Filter frequencies can be swept or modulated by another voltage source. Amplifiers, the volume control, can be controlled by envelopes, which are themselves controlled and modulated by voltage. All of that together comes together to produce the sound of the synth nearly instantaneously. I mean, we're talking nanoseconds from when you hit the key to when the sound is out of the speakers. But as cool as that is, it has a couple problems. You can't do presets. You can only do generally monophonic synths. You can have one voice, one oscillator. So starting in the mid to late 70s, analogs kept expanding in terms of the capabilities. Moog made them smaller and more portable, but the development of smaller microprocessors made digital control possible and relatively cheap by condensing the space and weight needed into a smaller package, allowing users to do things like store presets and then recall them, creating new models for filters, not just low-pass, high-pass, bandpass, but Butterworth style, finite infinite response, infinite impulse response filters, anything like that. Digital controlled oscillators avoided one of the major hazards of analog synths, which is tuning drift, that you have to let the oscillator warm up and settle into tune before you can play it. And most importantly, polyphony, the ability to play multiple notes simultaneously, to play chords, to play two independent melodies on the keyboard, became possible due to digital control and lower cost. The first major digital synth to talk about is the Oberheim FVS-1 from 1975 by Tom Oberheim. It was the first commercially available synth capable of playing polyphonic music. It was based on the internal circuitry of a Mini Moog D and Oberheim's SEM, or Synth Expansion Module, which allowed you to expand the number of voices at one voice per SEM module. It was also the first synth to add portamento to the keyboard so that you could play one key and then the next, and it would just swoop between the pitches. And it was one of the first to add a preset programmer. It was classically used by Chick Corea in jazz, Fleetwood Mac, Herbie Hancock, John Carpenter, yes, on his score for The Terminator, Prince, Pink Floyd, Rush, Styx, and Tangerine Dream. This was followed by Dave Smith's Sequential Circuits Prophet 5 in 1978, the first fully programmable polyphonic synth, and the first one to use a microprocessor. This was used by Michael Jackson, Tangerine Dream, Dr. Dre, John Carpenter, Suzanne Ciani, and was the other major synth used on the score of The Terminator. And here is the Oberheim and the Prophet 5, which they still make profits to this day. It is a classic. Moving into the later part of the 70s, we have two major synths. The Synclavier of 1977. This was a polyphonic synthesizer and digital sampler that used an early implementation of John Chowning's FM synthesis algorithms. It had a hard and floppy disk recording capability, and most importantly, a real-time CPU, so you had microsecond accurate responses. However, The Synclavier and its sequel, the Synclavier 2, were both ridiculously expensive, roughly around $200,000. Fortunately, they have an app available now for the iPod and the iPad and iPhone that are generally much, much cheaper. This was used primarily in a lot of film scores, but also in a lot of prog rock. It was used by Laurie Anderson, the band Genesis, Suzanne Ciani, Depeche Mode. Michael Jackson used it extensively on Thriller. Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits used it in his film score for The Princess Bride. Kraftwerk used it. Paul Simon used it a lot on Graceland. It was also used on the theme of The X-Files and on Frank Zappa's classic album Jazz from Hell, which is entirely created on the Synclavier. Another really important one from that era is the Fairlight CMI, or Computer Music Instrument. Like the Synclavier, it was a digital synthesizer, sampler, and also workstation, but it used a light pen so that you could actually draw and edit samples and waveforms, harmonic partials, and sequences. This was used by Phil Collins, Stevie Wonder, Yes, the McLean Mix, Peter Gabriel, Kate Bush, including on a lot of the stuff that is played on the latest season of Stranger Things. And most notably, it is where we get the infamous Orc 2 sample. There is a really great video that I have linked to in the book that shows the evolution of that sample from the CMI to Bruno Mars. I strongly recommend you take a look at that. It's 9 minutes of awesomeness. And here is Frank Zappa with his Synclavier and the Fairlight CMI. In the early 1980s, synths were everywhere, but there was a major problem. Every synth from every different manufacturer used a different voltage standard, connectors, and just general operational principles. So nothing was really interoperable. This led to a proposal at the Audio Engineering Society, or AES, in 1981 to create a universal synth interface. That became a collaboration between a number of very important people in the history of synthesis and drum machines, including Dave Smith, Roger Lynn, and the Roland Corporation of Japan. The result was the MIDI 1.0 spec, which was published in 1983 and demoed at the NAMM show, showing a sequential circuits Prophet connected to a Roland Jupiter 6 using MIDI. This was beyond impressive. You could play on the keyboard of the Jupiter and make the Prophet make noise. And you could do it in reverse. You could play on the Prophet and make the Jupiter make noise. And these were from completely different companies, completely different synthesis algorithms, but they could talk to each other. This blew people's minds, but it really took off due to its inclusion on the Yamaha DX7, which was a staple of pop music from the 80s through the 90s into the early 2000s. But in the 80s and 90s, computers also got much more powerful and began to sequence MIDI data. This started in 1983 with the Atari Corporation. They were the first computer manufacturer to put MIDI ports onto their computers. And in fact, the very first application to use MIDI was not a music program. It was a game called MIDI Maze that allowed multiple computers to be connected via MIDI and have a deathmatch. It is the first networked first-person shooter. But they got down to doing music apps very quickly and were followed by Apple. In 1988 and 1989, the Next Corporation, which was Steve Jobs' side business after he was fired from Apple and before he came back in the early 2000s, that was paired up with the ISPW, or EarCam Signal Processing Workstation, developed at EarCam over in Paris. This allowed serious signal processing hardware to exist in a computer for the first time, with software that allowed a composer to program and modify multiple MIDI modules and microphone inputs in real time. This led to the development of Max FTS, or Faster Than Sound, which we will talk about Max in later videos and chapters. It was first used to control different reverb modules on Philippe Monnery's piece for piano and electronics Pluton, and became the Max MSP programming language that still exists and is used extensively in electronic music today. But as this happened, computer power kept going up while prices kept going down. Starting in the 90s, we see early soft synths and samplers starting to exist on Mac and PC. These are programs that emulate the hardware of a synthesizer or of a sampler. Because they exist entirely on a computer, they don't take up space, and they sounded fairly decent. So most studios started to adopt those and sell off all of their old gear. The upshot of that is that during the early 90s, pawn shops were flooded with very, very cheap synths and drum machine. And in fact, this had a profound effect on hip-hop, with lots of artists buying up synths and drum machines that they had been lusting over for years at absolute bargain prices, including the celebrated Roland TR-808 drum machine, the TB-303 bass sequencer, and the Mini Moog Model D. But the real killer app came out in 1999. That was Rebirth by Propellerhead Software, and that, more than anything else, was the death knell of hardware synthesizers, because it perfectly recreated all aspects of the TR-808 and TB-303, and led to their follow-up program, Reason, in November of 2000. Reason is a modular synthesizer rack, very similar to the racks that studios would have had. It had multiple different types of sequencers, drum machines, all sorts of synthesizers. You could just create your own virtual rack, patch things together, sequence things out, and take the output directly into your digital audio workstation. At that point, it became a must-have, and it really accelerated the shift away from hardware to software even more. Here is a picture of Rebirth, and here is the Reason rack from a recent version. This is version 12. But analog didn't die, even if it did briefly fade away. Beginning in 1996, over in Germany, Dieter Doepfer started working on the problem of wanting to create his own independent modules so that you could mix and match the parts of a synthesizer. This resulted in the Eurorack standard, which is a standardized set of size and voltage constraints for synthesizer modules. This makes it really easy to go and buy different modules from different manufacturers. I can buy an oscillator from Make Noise, a filter from Moog. I can get a complex oscillator from Verbose, or some really, really crazy stuff from Audio Damage. And it's now the default format for most synth modules. We also had inexpensive synths starting in the 2000s and really taking off in 2014 with Moog's Werkstatt 01, which is a semi-modular Moog synth where if you don't plug in any cables, it'll still produce sound. But it had breadboard-style jumpers, so you could jump different points and reroute the voltage on it and create even more different sounds. That same year, Korg came out with their Volca line, which is a recreation of classic bass synths, drum machines, FM synths, and in 2019, the Volca Modular, that is similar to the Moog Werkstatt in the sense that it is a semi-modular jumper-style synth, but with a West Coast approach to synthesis. similar to the Buchla. So here is a picture of a Eurorack synth. In fact, this is my Eurorack synth. And you can see different manufacturers. I've got Mutable Instruments, Doepfer, 2HP, Make Noise, Expert Sleepers, Clavis. Lots of different stuff coming in here. Different types of filters, different types of effects. And all of those parts can be mixed and matched. I can replace it and remake my rack however I desire it for a specific performance. Here is the Volca modular. And again, it is semi-modular, so it will play if you just use the touch keyboard at the bottom. But you can also grab different little bits of wire and jump them to create different paths and thus different sounds. There are also some really new and interesting synths out there. Soma Labs Lyra 8 is a particular favorite. It's an 8 oscillator synth where each oscillator is paired in feedback loops to create frequency modulation that is extremely unstable and almost alive. And so they describe it as an organismic or organism synthesizer. Very, very cool technology. And then we have the Rebel Technology Witch from 2021, which uses the OWL modular platform. This is really interesting because if you know how to write code in Pure Data, MaxMSP's Gen language, Soul, Faust, or C++, you can do that. Then upload that to the synth to change the firmware and thus change its capabilities. Very, very cool. A lot of different possibilities open up as a result of that. And here is a picture of the Lyra 8. So that is just a very quick and brief history of synthesizers from 1876 to the present day. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and get ready because in the next chapter, we're going to be diving into how synthesizers work.